Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. How are you?
I'm good. Well, people are slowly rolling in.
Yes. Are we able to hear and see each other? Yes.
Yes, can you hear me? Oh, you can't see the t-shirt. Again, it's the same. I- Oh, well, just for reference, I am wearing a t-shirt that is suitable. I think maybe we can just wait another minute and then probably we can start.
Yeah,
Inshallah.
inshallah.
Fantastic.
While we wait, I'll adjust my flower as well.
Oh,
Instagram is a little bit tighter than we thought
yes.
in the frame, the video frame itself.
Not. We don't get the full. We don't get the full thing. Okay.
It looks like people are still joining, so maybe do we want to give them another minute?
Yes. Yep. We can do that. No, people are very on time, quite prompt.
Yeah,
Thank
quite
you.
prompt, absolutely.
Good. And what time is it for you?
It is 1 p.m. Eastern time. I'm in Washington,
Okay.
D.C. What time is it for you?
In London, it's 6 o'clock,
6
and
o'clock.
then Central Europe is
7.
7 p.m. Okay, that is fine. I think we can start because I think people will probably come in and out. Salam alaikum, everyone. My name is Zara. I'm here on behalf of FEMYSO. I joined the campaigns department quite recently in May, and I've been helping with the Srebrenica campaign. And today I'll be having a conversation with Alma Cidic, saying it hopefully correctly,
Great job.
yes. And do you want to maybe introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, thank you, Zara, and thank you to FEMYSO for inviting me to speak about this really important topic today. So, I know the first question was to just introduce myself a little bit. So after having earned my bachelor's and master's degrees in international relations and political science at Syracuse University in upstate New York, I began my career in strategic communications. Over the past several years, I've gained experience across just a wide variety of sectors, including at intergovernmental organizations. I worked at the Council of Europe, which is the continent's leading human rights organization, at startups, different agencies, and Big Four consulting, all in strategic communications space. Currently, I work as a communications and organizational transformation consultant or an expert in the biotech sector. I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, hence the invitation to speak here today, northwestern Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kotor Varoš. At 6 months of age, my hometown fell into the hands of the aggressor, and thus my family and I were forced to flee. Today, that we continue to view that area as temporarily occupied territory. My family and I were forced to flee and leave our home. We became internally displaced first. And then after some time of internal displacement, we were forced to flee as refugees. I prefer to use the term expellees because we were expelled from our home. Refugee tends to focus on the idea of seeking refuge in a third country. So to Croatia, across the Middle East, then we went to Slovakia, eventually to Germany, and then in 1998, Germany issued a repatriation act that would force you either to return home or to go to a third country for a permanent solution, for permanent asylum. We were not able to return home due to circumstances that I already discussed. And so we ended up in the United States. So kind of my story from the time I was 8 or 9 years old on was a kind of refugee and immigrant story here in the United States.
Wow. Yeah, there's so many. You started off with your kind of your professional career background, and it's quite varied. And to hear about the different countries and the experience that you had, it seems so difficult and quite admirable that you had so much experience to try all these different sectors, and just wanted to extend a great thank you for you to be here and to have this conversation. So inshallah, we will be discussing the Srebrenica genocide, as today's the anniversary, the 28th anniversary since the 11th of July 1995. We will also be discussing the significance of commemoration. We will talk about how we can raise awareness we'll touch on the themes of genocide denial and triumphalism, and also, very importantly, Islamophobia, or anti-Muslim hatred. And inshallah, this will be a very productive and fruitful conversation. So thank you again for being here to tell your experience. And I guess we can, now that you've introduced yourself, we can maybe talk about what is the significance of commemorating the Srebrenica genocide?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that when we discussed this a little bit earlier in our pre-prep, we talked about just providing a little bit of context around Srebrenica and what happened in 1995 and kind of the broader context of the Bosnian War. So for those that have a little bit less context, the Bosnian War was from 1992 to 1995. It came as a culmination of events that started with the dissolution of Yugoslavia. So we were all set, with our neighbors, Serbia, Croatia, and other countries. We were a state, Yugoslavia, that dissolved, started its dissolution after the death of Tito in 1980. So that slow decline, right, allowed for sentiments of nationalism, of nationalism to really flare up, right? So in 1991, Croatia and Slovenia, two of what we'll say kind of were the wealthiest republics in Yugoslavia, they declared their independence from really a dissolving Yugoslavia that was really falling apart. And by 1992, when Slovenia and Croatia left, Bosnia was left in this Yugoslav rump state. And it was really left in the state where it was becoming very clear that its neighbor, Serbia, had aspirations of keeping this kind of idea, this greater Serbia of dominance in the region. And so Bosnia really didn't have a choice other than to declare its own secession from what was left of that Yugoslav rump state. It started with a referendum where 60-some% of the people agreed to secession. The population that did not agree to secession, no surprise, were the Bosnian Serbs. And with that, then the concentration, the kind of the war, the winds of war that had swept across Croatia came to Bosnia. Under the guise, kind of Serbia's guise was, okay, we're working to keep Yugoslavia together, but really the reality was the establishment of this vision of greater Serbia. That quickly devolved, the war in Bosnia quickly devolved from a kind of political and economic circumstances to really to genocide. Ethnic cleansing and genocide, and ethnic cleansing is really just a euphemism for genocide, for displacing entire demographies of people, and for the annihilation and extermination of a people from certain space. Srebrenica then happened in 1995. So we're looking, right, we talked about 1980s, early 1990s, the beginning of the war in 1992 in Bosnia. Srebrenica came at the tail end of the war in Bosnia in 1995, really as we're starting to negotiate peace talks sponsored by the United States. And so in a sense, it really was nothing spectacular, right, for us. For Bosnian Muslims that have gone through 3 years of war, of the siege of Sarajevo, of, we'll talk later a little bit about Prijedor, the white armbands, much like in the Holocaust, like the stars of David that marked Jewish citizens. The idea of concentration camps, mass graves, etc. So 3 years of this type of agony and being part of the genocidal apparatus, Srebrenica was a logical conclusion to all of that. And so in 1995, you have the folding of the last safe haven. Srebrenica was considered a safe haven. There was a very small, poorly outfitted Dutch battalion that was sent there to try to protect that safe haven, where there's thousands and thousands of refugees, internally displaced persons actually teeming in from other areas of Bosnia, Zvornik, Foča, Visegrad, coming in there hoping because the UN was there, that they would be safe. And really that Dutch battalion folded very quickly under Serbian pressure, and you have the consequences of that today. So over 8,000 young, mostly it was mostly men and boys, but also we often forget to mention the women and young children that were killed in Srebrenica that we're continuing to find in mass graves today.
Mm. Thank you for providing the context. I think it's provides it's very useful to understand why it's important today, and it's something that happened not too long ago, only 28 years ago, and I think we almost miss the context of what happened earlier on in the 80s and 90s. So I think it's quite beneficial to understand that. And moving on to asking, I guess, what are the ways that you personally have pursued to raise awareness about the Srebrenica genocide?
Yeah. So I became very conscious of the need to amplify this narrative message at a very early age. So around 16, 17, I became really, really involved with my community, with my local community and grassroots organizing and efforts. The age of 20, at that time, since then, other events have far outstripped and outshined what we did at that time. But at that time, we organized one of the largest Srebrenica commemorations outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we had over in Syracuse, New York. I helped to lead a project where we worked with a local radio station and a local radio and TV station to create a short documentary with survivors of the Srebrenica genocide in Syracuse, in the Syracuse community in New York, where they talked about kind of the harrowing experiences of escaping Srebrenica. And we worked on screening, so we hosted a screening of that documentary with, we invited congressmen, senators, our mayor, local political officials, local radio, and other news networks. And over 600 people attended that particular event to talk about, okay, what happened, the truth of Srebrenica. Since then, I've been involved, I mentioned the Council of Europe. I've worked in advocating about the Srebrenica narrative and the truth of the Srebrenica genocide at the Council of Europe. I've written quite a bit about what happened in Bosnia as a whole. We talk about Srebrenica and Bosnia as a whole. I have a piece published with my husband actually in Al Jazeera English. And I've also currently we're working, my husband and I and a few other members of our community, our intellectual and academic community, are working on establishing a 501c4 organization in Washington, D.C., which is a lobbying organization, but really an advocacy organization that will not only work to amplify the interests or work on developing ties and relationships between the United States and Bosnia, but and kind of furthering the interests of the Bosnian diaspora here in the United States, but will also really work to preserve the narrative of the Bosnian genocide and what really happened, the truth of what happened.
Yes, I think I'm surprised actually that there isn't a similar organization already, because you would think, especially with the Dayton Peace Agreement, and like you said, it was facilitated by the US. The fact that there aren't the fact that there isn't such an organization, and it's really it's great to hear the different initiatives that you've been part of, and also we will touch on that later on about what are potentially things that we can do. And it's really fantastic to hear the different initiatives on various levels. I wanted to then move on to the stages of genocide, and perhaps we could talk about the stages of genocide, and in particular genocide denial and genocide triumphalism, and why that's important to talk about today.
That's an excellent question. I will say for the last thing that there are institutions, and I want to be able to recognize them. There are some existing institutions and really some really great grassroots advocacy that is happening across the diaspora. Remember in Srebrenica, FEMYSO is doing these wonderful events. In the United States, there were some institutions that that have worked on this particular issue. In Canada, there's a Genocide Institute, but we don't have necessarily a voice in DC that will speak to Capitol Hill where decisions are made, particularly in regards to the Western Balkans. And that's what we're really working on establishing here now. In terms of genocide denial and triumphalism, and you mentioned, you alluded to the stages of genocide. I think it's really important that we just refresh our memory. I know this audience is very well informed, but refresh our memory on kind of genocide itself, or the definition of genocide itself. So often when we think of genocide, our mind immediately floats to kind of the extermination or annihilation, or really the act of killing, right? Very often. Or the demographic changes that come with ethnic cleansing and displacing people from their homes. And that is really at the core of what genocide is. But in addition to that, there are many other methods that are employed, right? Such as mass rape. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, some figures go up to 200,000, saying, you know, the approximations of women being raped as an act of war, and the dishonor that that brings, and the fact, this ideology of women being raped in order to birth Serbian babies, of Muslim women being raped to birth Serbian babies. So, you know, we talk about sexual violence, but we talk also about the annihilation of culturally significant places, you know, houses of worship, cemeteries, etc. So basically the erasure of a people, changing the names of schools, changing the names of streets, the erasure of a people completely from a place so that you erase their history. And that is something that continues on today. So 30 years post-war almost, we continue to battle with that. Now, if we talk about genocide denial and triumphalism, right, they're really two interrelated pieces. You know, if we talk about Gregory Stanton's kind of 10 stages of genocide, you start with kind of the discrimination, dehumanization, etc., and then you move into these latter stages, 9, 10, and 11, which is really denying that a genocide ever occurred, really revising history, revising historical events, and not allowing a national narrative to be formed around the historical truths. You know, one of the really concrete examples of that is that when we talk about the idea of mass graves, you know, where there's many continue, I mean, the Serb population continues today to say either that they don't exist, or that, you know, that they're fabricated, or that Bosnian Muslims themselves created mass graves by moving bodies, which is all absolutely, I mean, a complete falsehood, right? Where we talk about Srebrenica, we talk about Sarajevo and the Markala massacre, where a bomb was launched on a group of people at a outdoor market, where Serbian officials have said that Bosnian Muslims bombed themselves in order to get international attention. So that kind of revisionism. So that all goes into this idea of genocide denial. Triumphalism is a step ahead of that. So that is a term that was coined by a Bosnian professor that lives in Australia, Haris Halilovic, who said, okay, in the context of Bosnia, we have something unique that has happened, which is that we've moved past the stage of denial, and the perpetrators themselves, so the Bosnian Serbs who are the perpetrators themselves, have now started a narrative where they have victimized, so where they've become the victims, right? And in becoming the victims, they take their war criminals, Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, that have internationally recognized at the Hague, at the ICTY, they have rulings and verdicts against them, right, that show that they are war criminals and what they have, the crimes that they have committed, right, and have said these are our heroes, right? And so war criminals become heroes, and they become fighters for freedom. They become fighters to preserve the integrity of the Serbian people, and they become symbols of to aspire to for younger generations, So, and today, if you walk the streets of Banja Luka, which we can talk a little bit about later, you know, Banja Luka is a city, it's actually 30 kilometers away from where I was born. It is now Serb dominated, right? In Banja Luka, if you walk the streets of Banja Luka, you will see kiosks where they sell mugs and sell t-shirts with the faces of Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, Milosevic, etc., that glorify these people as war heroes. So that is really what triumphalism is about.
I wanted, thank you for explaining the differences. I think this is an aspect that we don't pay enough attention to. I think it's neglected, and it situates it in the current day, the fact that this has been denied, and not only denied but celebrated, as you've explained. But perhaps could you speak to the role of soldiers but also of civilians, and if possible, maybe if you could explain the context of Bosnia with the Federation and Republika Srpska, just to give a fuller understanding of it.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we'll start with that latter part, the Republika Srpska and Federacija. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, if we think about, is, you know, a fully sovereign state in and of itself. But within that state, we are really divided. The territory is divided into 51% the Federation, 49% the Republika Srpska. Republika Srpska is really, it's really the result of a policy of appeasement from the West. There's no other way to put it, right? So 49% of the territory is de facto, I mean, it's de facto occupied by the aggressor. It is a semi-autonomous republic or entity within itself. Yes, it is under the guise of the Bosnian national government, but in reality, it has its own state structures. It has its own president. It has its own flag. Actually, very recently, several days ago, the president of the entity, Milorad Dodik, previously, right now, there's been Željko Cvijanović has replaced him, but really, I mean, they're one and the same. They have worked on a memorandum that is denying, basically has de facto legislatively seceded the state, the autonomous republic itself, from what is equivalent to the Supreme Court, right, of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So they are basically claiming legislative autonomy, and what that means is that they will not, they will not follow the rulings of the Supreme Court of the country, right, which is a really, really dangerous precedent. I mean, that steps away when you have a flag, right, when you have your own state structures, when you have your own court system, when you are not integrated into the national kind of superstructures of the state, you are basically setting the groundwork for secession. So that's the Federation and Republika Srpska. And today, Republika Srpska used to be, that territory itself used to be very ethnically mixed. Today, it is predominantly Bosnian Serb because of the ethnic cleansing and genocide that occurred in the 1990s. You mentioned the role of civilians or of regular, ordinary people in the war. So often when we think about war, right, we think about states and armies and paramilitary troops, etc. In the case of Bosnia, this was a really personal war. It's not really, they say war, right? War requires two parties, right? In this case, this is not a war of two parties. It was really an aggressive faction, right? And then a group of people that really sought to defend themselves by all means possible, right? And I think you and I had an opportunity to connect earlier and talk about a particularly poignant example of that. For those of you that, this is just a bit of a trigger warning. It includes a story of a young child. So for those of you that would like to step away for a couple of minutes, this might be a good opportunity to do so. So in the case of one particular village, Biljane, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this is not something that an isolated case, this is a case that happened over and over and over and over again in cities all across and towns all across Bosnia and Herzegovina, but this one's a particularly atrocious case. It was the local population, so not the military, not the paramilitary troops, but the local population led by the local police that organized, the Bosnian Serb population that organized and pulled out its Bosnian Muslim neighbors and committed mass executions. One of those executions was of a young family, a young woman in her 30s who was holding her 4-month-old baby in her arms, and her 4-year-old son was sitting next to her. And they executed the mother, the baby, with a bullet wound to the head, and the young boy, when he did not die at the first bullet, the second, third, they ended up using a machine gun to machine him down into the mass grave in this particular region. And the only way that it was found was that years later, in the riverbank right next to where the mass grave was, they found the pacifier of the little girl and were able to trace then and uncover the mass grave. So when we think about genocide, really that is what genocide is, right? The extermination of an entire people's, their families.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing the example. I think it's unthinkable. It's so horrific to think, exactly like you said. It's not just, we imagine wars in terms of soldiers, but we don't really think of the role of civilians, because they were also the perpetrators. That's right. And also give an example of and also these perpetrators, because it happened relatively not too long ago, they're still walking the streets of Bosnia and Herzegovina today, and they haven't stood trial. And as for the mass graves, just to provide more context, they're not just primary mass graves. That's right. This year they've found 30 victims will be buried, but it's not just primary mass graves, but they are secondary and tertiary, which means that the first mass grave, they dug them up, and then they moved those bodies like 100 kilometers somewhere else, and then they buried them again, which means that unfortunately one person might be found in 4 different places. And it's such a it's just so like heartbreaking and frustrating to think that there are people today that know where those mass graves are located, right, but in the context of genocide denial and triumphalism, they're not going to talk about that, because that makes them guilty. But thank you for providing the example. And
that's actually, I want to say that's a really important point. So I think it's important to say why, right? Why the secondary and tertiary mass graves? It was really to cover tracks, yes, right? So the idea is that we would cover the tracks of what happened in a particular place, move bodies, so that you could not find the forensic evidence that might link particular atrocities to specific individuals. I think another thing that's really important in what you said is not only that the people who committed these atrocities are living with us today, or our neighbors today, is that they're sitting in benches in Parliament, right? So they're sitting in significant political functions. They are leading the media in Republika Srpska. And so they are really influential people in society today. The people who committed these atrocities yesterday are deciding about the future of the state today, right? The last thing that I will say here, it's really important as well, is when we say not all Serbs, that's absolutely 100% true, right? Not all Serbs. But at the same time, when we look at the polling of the regular population, or the regular citizenry in Republika Srpska today, some 74% outright say that Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, Slobodan Milosevic, etc., are war heroes, right? 15 or so percent say we're undecided, right? When you say you're undecided, that you belong to that 74 some percent.
Yeah.
So we have over 90% of the population that continues to either actively support or tacitly support a genocidal regime that continues to build generations and feed generations a falsehood, a false history, right? And create generations of people that might repeat this history.
Yes. And I think it's really, as I was saying before, it's just really important to understand, like, thank you for bringing up the statistics, because I don't think we recognize how much of it is like entrenched in society. And also before we were discussing how the younger generation are supposed to be kind of liberal and progressive, and you would think a bit more open to other people, but they are now growing up with these ideas, and they're growing up in these silos where they have this genocide denial and triumphalism, which has become mainstreamed. I just wanted to, there's one question from the chat, and someone's asking if we can draw a line of analysis that connects the Serbian aggression to today's situation in northern Kosovo, if you have capacity to answer that question.
Yeah, that is a really interesting, multifaceted question. So this all, I mean, really, when we kind of boil everything down to the core, northern Kosovo, so Serbia continues to see Kosovo as its own as a piece of its own territory. There's a lot of mythologies that, go back to the 1300s that talk about the Battle of Kosovo Polje, where the Serbs felt that they were humiliated by the Ottoman Turks. So all of this goes back, and everything that happens, everything that's happening regionally, right, goes back to these mythologies and ideas of the Ottoman Empire and the the agony or the discrimination of Serbs during that particular period of history. And so that linking of Kosovars or Bosniaks, etc., to Turks, to etc., this kind of orientalization of those peoples, that's all packaged in that particular box, right? When we think about Kosovo today, the question for Serbia is, yes, it's a question of identity, but it's a geopolitical, right? There's a lot of geopolitical. There's a stake, a territorial stake there. There's a stake as the national identity. There's a stake as to, like, we need to be able to win, right? Win. It's something we cannot allow. We cannot allow Kosovo to have its own kind of national identity and preserve its own national integrity. And so really the fight for Kosovo is just a continuation in the end. I mean, when you boil it down, it's just a continuation of the fight for the idea of a greater Serbia, right? It has implications for Bosnia, right? There are territorial implications for Bosnia as well, because now you have the linking, right, of territories like Kosovo, like Republika Srpska, etc. They're all kind of the expansion of the idea that Serbia is really the regional hegemon, right? The regional, the rightful regional hegemon. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for providing that insight. And I wanted, sorry, I'm mindful of time, but it's already 35 past here, to talk about Islamophobia. I wanted to ask, what is the impact of the Srebrenica genocide on Islamophobia today?
We can talk about this in the context of Bosnia itself, and then in the wider context, the wider global context. So in the case of Bosnia itself, we continue to see, this denial of even what happens in Srebrenica, despite the fact that you have rivers and rivers of graves. I mean, everyone has seen the images of the white graves of thousands and thousands that are lying, that are buried to date. But the larger context, the global context of Srebrenica is one that, because there was no real reckoning, no real public reckoning, I'll say, or any kind of real structural, any attempt to really structurally address what happened in Bosnia, right? And because of this appeasement, where 49% of the territory was given to Serbs, etc., it's been seen as really a triumph, right? A triumph of a genocidal agenda. When we see what happened in Norway with Anders Breivik, or if we see Christchurch, right, in New Zealand, the people who committed Anders and the young man who committed the shooting, the mosque shooting in Christchurch, they were inspired. They were inspired by the idea of these of Serbian nationalism, of the fight to preserve a Christian Europe, right? They played songs. They had, I mean, they found kind of war songs and poetry and everything that really served as the basis for these young people to say, we are revolutionaries, right? We are revolutionaries, and therefore we must save the Christian West from Islam. And that all comes from the fact that we never truly reckoned with the lessons of Srebrenica and with the lessons of the genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Yes, I think it's really important that you bring up not just those two, the terrorist attacks, but how it's connected to anti-Muslim hatred today, and how I just think it's exactly like you're saying. If there isn't really recognition or accountability, and if there's no challenge to that sort of narrative, then it will only be fostered. And this kind of leads to the next question of, what are the main takeaways that you want Muslims to learn about the Srebrenica genocide?
Yeah, we touched on this a little bit when you and I had the opportunity to talk earlier. I know it's a bit of a controversial statement, but Bosnia was in a really unique, in the 1990s, and continues to be today, in a really unique position, right? It's kind of a paradox. At once, it did receive a significant amount of media coverage, but that media coverage had very little impact, right? And when we look at the position of Bosnian Muslims today, and even in the, in the 1990s, it's almost as if we were too white and too European for our issue to be a salient issue in the Muslim world, right? So Bosnia itself does not receive to this day, the same kind of platform as, Palestine, or if we think about the Uyghur population in China. Yet we continue to live under intense pressure and under the intense fear that history will repeat itself in the near future. Right, but at the same time, for Western Europeans, we were not white enough or European enough, and we didn't share the same history, right? The same kind of European history as this concert of Western states, for it to be an issue that Europe would really step in and help. I mean, in the context of the 1990s war, step in before these atrocities would occur, right? And so it's like, today we have, and I have a lot of gratitude for this, and I'm really thankful for the fact that we have a lot of kind of grassroots advocacy. Diaspora communities themselves are starting to organize better. We have organizations like Remembering Srebrenica. FEMYSO is doing wonderful work every year in commemorating the genocide. But nonetheless, we still don't see this as a kind of globally salient issue, right? And we don't see this as a standard kind of part of even what we teach kind of younger generations, right? Younger generations to say, okay, we do have this idea of, what's happening in Palestine, et cetera, and what's happening in China and other places in the world, right? But we have these domicile European Muslims that are consistently throughout its history, right? So 1990s was just one event that consistently throughout its history is living under this intense pressure and intense kind of periods and episodes of there's previous genocides to this, right? And it was always targeting the European Muslim elite in that particular region. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And as you said, I think I'm really proud when I see Muslims at the forefront for these specific issues, but when it comes to Bosnian genocide, when it comes to Srebrenica genocide, I feel like the information is lacking, and even if there is, or the advocacy is, it's very much it's all centered on the 11th of July, but then unfortunately everything around that, it doesn't. I don't see as much. But I wanted to bring up, someone's asked in the chat, what were the actions taken by the EU and their impacts in the genocide? How is the EU or not addressing the legacy of the Srebrenica genocide and promoting stability in the Western Balkans? Because I know actually, last summer I was there in Srebrenica. I studied violence, conflict and development for my master's, and I looked at the memorialization of sexual violence at the Srebrenica Genocide Memorial Center, and how the Dutch defense minister, she issued an apology on behalf of the Netherlands. But maybe you can talk a bit more about the EU, and especially with your experience. I know Council of Europe, it's the EU bubble, it's all very confusing, but if you can just provide your insight on that.
Yeah, I think the relationship with the European Union, with the United States in particular, and I'll say the United States is probably in some ways a more important actor in Bosnia today than the European Union in some instances. In some cases, the argument can be made for that. There's a very complicated relationship, right? A very complicated relationships in terms of how they are involved in the political superstructure, the post-Dayton political superstructure of Bosnia, and the politics of ethnicization, right, of the continued ethnicization of the state. So if we think about the political implications, and I'm not sure if the question is more geared towards kind of like grassroots programs, et cetera, but if we just think about the political situation, right, we have a very complicated relationship with the European Union, with European Union actors in the United States, insofar as, you know, there's on the face of it, you know, in post-Dayton, the story is one of democratization, of getting past kind of the ethnic structure of the state, etc. But really, all that is happening in terms of how our electoral politics, how we're being politically splintered as a political representation of Bosniak Muslims, everything that's happening in the state today is really continuing to create these hard ethnic lines, and to continue to build a system that is based upon discrimination, really a purely discriminatory system. However, it's not all, I don't want to say it's all bad, right? When we think about the European Union and institutions, well, the Council of Europe is not a European Union institution, but if we think about European institutions, I will say that there has been a significant amount of money that's been funneled into a lot of resources, right? Money, resources, people, etc., into programs. I worked in the division of confidence building measures that aim to foster dialogue between different ethnic groups, that aim to look at issues, you know, you mentioned child abuse, and, you know, sexual violence. You know, this is one of the areas that the Council of Europe really seeks, for example, with the Istanbul Convention, to address, to say, okay, this is an issue that is shared, right? It doesn't have an ethnicity, it's not a political issue, it's a deeply personal issue. And so the Council of Europe seeks to find areas like that, where they can bring together, you know, Bosnian, Serb, Croat, and Bosniak or Bosnian Muslim victims of domestic violence, to talk about, to use that as a platform to continue to foster dialogue. On that grassroots level, I will say on that grassroots kind of dialogue and bridge building level, the European Union has been a really, really strong partner with local institutions in trying to find solutions and trying to provide the resources that will help to foster at least a new generation of people who will think differently, right? Think differently about the future of Bosnia.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for providing the insight about the EU level, and I guess now that you've explained kind of the Srebrenica genocide, we've discussed genocide denial and triumphalism, and kind of this hierarchy of Muslims, or how the Srebrenica genocide and the Bosnian genocide in general is not really seen as a global issue. Coming back to European Muslims, as we're here part of FEMYSO, how would you like European Muslims to learn, sorry, how would you like European Muslims to advocate in terms of raising awareness about the Srebrenica genocide? And similarly, where do you think that we are falling short in our current advocacy on Srebrenica?
Yeah. So I think I'll start with, I'll start with from my own kind of doorstep first. In terms of Bosnia, I think in terms of Bosnia and the Bosnian diaspora and, what's coming out of the Memorial Center, Emir Sujagic is doing a fantastic job with the Memorial Center and really amplifying that institution to a new level, building new collaborations, and really kind of bringing more actors into the fold, more kind of international actors into the fold of telling the Srebrenica narrative. Though in terms of what's happening from Bosnia and the Bosnian diaspora, while we're doing well in that grassroots community, grassroots kind of organizing, we haven't really done a really good job of really building institutions that will carry the story and the lessons from Srebrenica and Bosnia forward, where they can have real impact on decision makers, right? The other kind of failure I think that we've had generally in the narrative around Srebrenica is that we've localized it to just Srebrenica. So Srebrenica, in many people's minds, is this isolated incident, right? This atrocity that came out of nowhere, and we haven't connected it with the greater narrative of the 1990s war in Bosnia. We talked about the mass rape of women, of the concentration camps, of the white armbands in Prijedor, of the little mini Srebrenicas. You and I talked about earlier a little bit about my own town, where we had a little mini Srebrenica in 1993, where it's those exact same scenario of young, of men and young boys trying to escape over the hills and through the forests, and 800 or so of them were massacred. And that escape when Kotorvaš fell over the village of Večići. So, we have Visegrad, Foča, Zvornik, all of these places across Bosnia and Herzegovina that had the garage that experienced Srebrenica long before Srebrenica, right? And so we need to be able to start to tell that narrative. In terms of how, right? In terms of how, I think what's really important are organizations like this and events like this, right? FEMYSO, thank you so much for all of the efforts and time put into this. One, we all need to inform ourselves. Two, we need to understand this and connect this. All of us need to connect this into the greater narrative of, as you talked about, Islamophobia today and the consequences for generations to come. Three, once we really understand that, we need to start to use whatever is at our disposal, right? So university students, raise your voice in classes, right? Organize remembrance events. Duke University does a wonderful job. There's a student organization at Duke University that is committed to the remembrance of all genocides, right? And they do a name reading at the university quad. So events like this. for those who have the platform and the ability, right, start writing in, you know, for local news, local papers. If for, you know, professors at universities should really be looking to publish in leading publications, foreign policy, etc. Right? I think partnering with other communities, right, partnering across to instate kind of pressure on our local elected officials, or, you know, on congressmen and senators in the United States, or whatever the equivalent is, parliamentarians in Europe, to really start to amplify that narrative. And the last I will say, I think one of the most poignant kind of experiences that I had, that I think is just something that we really need to be thinking about, and that the Memorial Center, Suljagic, is doing with the Memorial Center as well, is really partnering with existing institutions that memorialize, like Holocaust museums, right? One of the most moving experiences that I had was in the Holocaust Museum in New York City, where they dedicated an entire wall to the Bosnian genocide, right? In order to be able to amplify this narrative across broader populations.
Yes, I think it's. I've been making notes of all the initiatives that we could possibly do. I think it's really useful to hear kind of what are practical things that we can do. And I guess if perhaps you're not very familiar, like you said, it's just kind of informing yourself, and then from there informing others. And I personally actually, inshallah, I'm organizing a film screening in London of Kovadis Aida, which came out a few years ago, and it follows a UN translator. It focuses on the Srebrenica genocide in particular, and that's actually all of our questions for today. I can't believe it's nearly an hour. It's gone by very quickly, but I just wanted to say a huge thank you to you, Alma. It's been so insightful to hear your perspective, your insight, and I just think we need to have more kind of Bosnians and non-Bosnians like advocating for what's happened, and it's been a very, very useful, valuable discussion. I'll just say that on behalf of the audience that are here and listening in, and it's really commendable, your efforts, and we really appreciate your time on such a sensitive and important day as we commemorate the 8,372 men and boys and girls and women that were killed in the Srebrenica genocide. And I think, inshallah, please just inform yourself and whatever circles that you're in to discuss this. It's so important as European Muslims, as non-European Muslims, for this to be kind of like at the forefront in this current context of Islamophobia. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone that's attended as well.
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you, FEMYSO, and really thank you to the audience for taking the time. I know that this is really for everyone who is a victim of the genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It really is meaningful when we see people participating, when we see others allying with us to share this narrative, when we see across social media the Srebrenica flower being shared. So thank you to everyone, and I hope that we can continue to collaborate with each other in the future.
Yes, inshallah. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Take care.
Salam.